Hi, everyone. Today, we're very happy to have Emily Anna in our seminar. Emily is currently a research assistant professor at TTAC, where her research interests are on the intersection of ethical algorithm design and socially responsible machine learning. Before TTAC, she got her PhD in statistics and data science from the University of Pennsylvania, where she was advised by Michael Kearns and Aaron Roth. And after TTAC, starting in September of 2024, she will be an assistant professor in the operations research group at CMU's Tepper School of Business. And today she will tell us about balance filtering via disclosure control proxies. It's all yours, Emily.
All right, thanks, Saeed. Yeah, so thanks for having me here. I'm very excited to tell you today about some recent work with Tiffany Dang from Amazon and Michael Kearns and Aaron Roth from Penn. So data quality and machine learning ethics has been in the news quite a bit recently. In 2018, Joy Buolamwini, who was a PhD student in the MIT Media Lab, was experimenting with some image classification systems, some gender classification systems that one of her colleagues was using for a research project. And these systems would kind of take an image with the face in it and then classify it as male or female. And Joy was dismayed to find that the system she was playing with did not even recognize her face. And the only way she could get it to recognize her was when she finally put on a white mask. So she didn't jump to conclusions. She tried with 3 other popular software, and 2 out of the 4 did not recognize her face, and the other 2 misgendered her. Now, when she kind of dug into this more deeply, and then it ended up publishing on this, it was called the Gender Shades Project. It turned out that, there's no one behind the scenes who was there scheming, kind of trying to figure out how we could have these systems fail on dark-skinned women. It was that just a very tiny portion of the training data, and it turned out the testing data was dark-skinned female. So these systems boasted an accuracy rate of 97%, 99%, but the training data was about 75% white and 80% male. On Black women, it was often no better than a coin flip. So this brings into kind of question a lot of issues about data quality and also issues of kind of equity and fairness in machine learning. Similarly, we've been concerned about privacy, and Facebook has been in the news off and on. Around the same time, I think it was 2019, Facebook was sued by the FTC for about $5 billion for kind of some privacy violations. So what had happened here is that there was a change in the Facebook privacy policy. And when I was sharing pictures or information that I thought would be available to only friends, it turned out that third-party apps could actually get that data from my friends. So when I would use some third-party app like Cambridge Analytica, that software could go and it could kind of go through the tree of my Facebook friends and access some of their private data. So this also has quite dire consequences. There were lots of questions about whether this influenced elections. And in general, kind of these issues of privacy, fairness, data quality have been at the forefront, both in research and in popular news. So there are lots of situations where we might want to select a collection of data or individuals that is balanced or representative. And one issue is that we might not be able to explicitly select based on these attributes. So this could be for a variety of reasons. The attributes could be considered sensitive, so they might never have been collected in the first place. They could be redacted from the data that we see. They could be too resource intensive to collect, or selecting based on these attributes could just be illegal. So there was the recent Supreme Court case that determined, for example, that Harvard and UNC's race-conscious admissions programs violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So in short, it determined that affirmative action, as was enacted by Harvard and UNC, was not legally permissible. And at the same time, universities and many different organizations might still want to be able to collect a cohort of individuals or collect a data set that has some diversity properties or that has some desirable properties in terms of being kind of representative of different groups. So how could a college, for example, select a racially diverse cohort with explicit race-based affirmative action prohibited? So in this paper, we tackle this problem, and we have two main contributions. So the first contribution, we introduce a sampling scheme that is optimized to produce a balanced data set. And this does not deal with concerns about privacy or disclosivity. This is just optimized to collect a subset of individuals, say that is balanced with respect to race. And then in addition to that, we propose a proxy function that can be used for what we call the balanced filtering task that is guaranteed not to be too disclosive. So the way that this kind of second contribution, this proxy function, is going to work is that we're going to have a proxy learner. So we're going to have a collection of data with these sensitive attributes available. From this, we'll learn some proxy function that we can then use to sample from a much larger data set without the sensitive attribute. We can sample a balanced subsample. So the framework that we use, we consider a data domain divided into k-sensitive groups. And the labels here don't really matter, so I'll just talk about the non-sensitive features and sensitive features. We'll call the non-sensitive features X and the sensitive features Z, and I'm calling the data domain omega. And here's a figure with, for example, 3 different groups. I'll be thinking about disjoint groups in this talk, but we could also talk about overlapping groups that's covered in the paper. So Z will represent group membership, and it'll take values 1 through K. We will consider that at some expense, we can obtain a small sample of data with that sensitive attribute available. And then we're going to have a proxy function class Z hat that is going to map just X, so just the non-sensitive features, to some natural number. We'll call that the proxy group. And our goal is going to be to use this small sample to train a proxy function Z hat that can be used to collect a much larger data set D, such that even without looking at Z for the selection process, it turns out that D itself is balanced with respect to Z. And at least for that second contribution, Z hat, the proxy function, does not disclose too much about Z. And I'm going to define what I mean by balanced and disclosivity shortly. So when I talk about balance, I'll say that D, a data set, is balanced with respect to K groups if basically each group Z makes up 1/k of the data set. And I'll say that this is a uniform distribution over groups. And for disclosivity, we're going to talk about disclosivity as how much you can ascertain from a proxy function kind of above the amount that you would know from base rates alone. So we'll say that a proxy function Z hat is alpha disclosive if for all groups and all kind of proxy groups, so J in the range of Z hat, if the posterior, so the probability that an individual falls into any given group compared to the base rate for that group, if that difference is much kind of is very large, we'll say that that proxy is very disclosive. So as long as that difference between the posterior and the prior is less than or equal to alpha, we'll say that the function is alpha disclosive. And the proxy function for the kind of eventual proxy that will take into account disclosivity, we will represent it in the form of a decision tree. And this doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but we find that this is a useful representation for us to guarantee the properties that we like. So the proxy function will be a decision tree with disclosure control and balancing properties. In particular, we will ask that the set of points at each leaf of the proxy tree should not be strongly correlated with the protected attribute. So for the samples that are sorted into any of these groups, we don't want that distribution to be that different than the base rates. And we would like it to be the case that the distributions on protected attributes at each leaf should contain the uniform distribution in their convex hull. And we'll show that this property gives us kind of this balancing desiderata. And the way that we'll actually use the proxy function for the filtering task is that we'll have, so after we've trained our proxy function, we're going to now take this new sample of data that does not have Z accessible. For each sample X, we'll map that sample to a proxy group that has a corresponding acceptance probability. And again, we're going to do this by labeling the range of the proxy Z hat with acceptance probabilities. So if you get sorted into proxy group 1, I will accept you into the sample with probability rho sub 1. And our goal is going to be, with this fixed tree structure, is going to be to find sampling probabilities rho such that the distribution induced on sampled points is uniform over the protected attributes. So if we sample from groups strategically, we'd like it to be the case the final data set has a uniform distribution over, say, race or sex. And one of the key insights is that we can kind of talk about this balancing property in terms of kind of the uniform distribution being contained in the convex hull of these leaf-wise conditionals. So specifically, we're going to say that A is the matrix whose ith row is A sub I, which is the probability distribution over sensitive attributes Z given proxy group I. So that's the distribution over sensitive attributes restricted to that one leaf. And I'll call this the conditional distribution matrix. We're going to denote the convex hull of the rows of A by C of A. And we're going to let U, with entries 1 over K, be the uniform vector, which is going to be our target. And we show that if U, this uniform vector, is contained in the convex hull of the rows of A, then we can find sampling probabilities rho such that the distribution induced on sample points is uniform over Z.
Excuse me, I had a question.
Yeah.
So I have a high-level question about this pick of U, which is uniform. If you're trying to find representative samples, shouldn't you consider the true underlying distribution? What is it particular about this uniform that you want to hit?
So I'm talking about, right. So I think what you're thinking about representative is a sample that represents maybe the population at large. And what I'm talking about is a sample that has kind of a certain coverage for each group of interest. So maybe the population at large is, maybe for some university, it's 60% women and 40% men, but in our sample, we want 50% women, 50% men. So that would be our target, 50%, 50%. And that'll be different than the base rates in the population. I'm just generally talking about the uniform vector as the target, but you could in fact choose any vector that you wanted. So this specific choice here is, that's up to you. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand what is the objective that this uniform vector is suitable for. Because statistically, I think we do want to stick to the underlying true distribution, but I also understand we want to have coverage of all the subgroups maybe equal, you have equal coverage over the groups, but what is the objective that this is the optimal choice for?
Well, so
Um,
one is specifically if your end goal is to get a data set that has this type of balance. So even if you're not training a model on it, maybe you just want to select a cohort of individuals. So that was the kind of academic admissions example. So maybe your end goal is just to collect a set of individuals that has this certain distribution over races or sex. And you're not even concerned about training a model on this data.
right.
Yeah, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, because you know, if you train a model on data that has some kind of distortion in terms of the group proportions, and then you apply it to the underlying population, then that's probably not going to be the model that minimizes just your error straight up. You might like it to be the case that if you do this, it has some type of downstream fairness properties, where maybe it was before performing really poorly on Black women because they made up such a small percentage of the data. But then when you have this more balanced data set, you find that the disparity is a little bit less. So that was one of the kind of motivating examples.
Gee, Emily, can I just ask a quick question just related to that? So
Yeah.
if I understand correctly, if the true distribution was uniform, you wouldn't need this tree. You would just sample, and that would be it. So the whole challenge is that the underlying distribution is one thing, but you would like to sample according to something else, while at the same time, you don't have that, the feature, the protected attribute information.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. So I will keep going. Let's see where. Right. Okay, so we talked about kind of when do we know that it is possible to kind of obtain a balanced data set. We know that's possible if the uniform distribution here is in the convex hull of the rows of A. So let's assume that we have this proxy tree, and kind of later I'll talk about how we develop it. So later we'll talk about growing a tree, but let's just take kind of a slice for right now, so that we have a candidate proxy tree, and we'd like to try to solve this balancing problem. So what we can do is, if we want to so we'd like to find coefficients Q tilde here, just Q, so that we minimize the L2 distance between Q times A minus U. If this is 0, then this means that we found coefficients that set Q of A equal to 0, and then this is true because U was in the convex hull of A. And we'll constrain this to, again, because we're looking for kind of a convex hull solution, we'll ask that these coefficients are all non-negative and sum to 1. And this isn't going to exactly be the final sampling probability, so we'll have to normalize them. So to find the final sampling probabilities row, we're going to take the Q for each group, proxy group J, divided by the base rate for that proxy group, and then normalize. And this will give us sampling probabilities row sub J, such that if this L2 distance is 0, then sampling according to J will give us a perfectly balanced data set. And if not, then this will give us the kind of distribution that is closest to balance in L2 distance. So again, the algorithm for this, we call this a QP proxy sampling scheme. We'll draw a new sample X and Y, and so we can't view Z here. We'll compute the proxy group for that, so Z hat of X. And then with probability row sub Z hat of X, we'll accept that into the final sample. And we show that for fixed A, so for a fixed proxy tree, if, again, U is in the convex hull of A, sampling according to this algorithm produces a balanced data set. So now this brings up the question, what if we cannot, in fact, find coefficients that give us a perfectly balanced data set? And how can we develop a proxy that has this property or gets us really close to this property? At the same time, is it possible for us to kind of control the level of disclosivity in this process? So our approach is to actually grow a decision tree that is going to be alpha disclosive and lets us sample a balanced or a nearly balanced data set. And we're going to call this an alpha beta proxy because it has both balancing properties and disclosivity properties. So we'll call Z hat an alpha beta proxy if it is alpha disclosive. And remember that this is the maximum difference between the prior and the posterior on the distribution of oversensitive attributes. And then if kind of the L2 distance between the best sample, the kind of group distribution given by the best sampling scheme and the uniform, if that's less than or equal to beta. So if it's perfectly balanced, beta would be 0. If it's perfectly non-disclosive, alpha would be 0. But unless we start out with a data set that is perfectly balanced, we're going to have some non-zero alpha. So to learn a proxy, we'll be growing a decision tree to use as our proxy.
Sorry, Emily, can you flash C? What is CA again?
So C of A, that's the convex hull of the rows of this conditional distribution matrix. So each row in this matrix corresponds to a distribution of sensitive attributes in one of the proxy groups, in one of the leaves of those trees.
There's also a question in the chat.
Okay.
In the 9th slide, how to estimate the conditional probability A sub A.
Yeah, so during the training process, we have access to Z, so we can just calculate that. And let me just go back to the so here's this A matrix. So AI is a probability of Z given that Z hat of X is I. So at any point in this training process, we can just look at all those samples that have been sorted into group I, proxy group I, and we can look at the distribution over sensitive attributes. This gives us rows. We can combine them to form a matrix, and we can look at the convex hull of those rows. And again, the intuition for this is that if the uniform is in this convex hull, then there exists some way that we can sample from those groups where we can get a uniform. Right. Okay, so again, we want the conditional distribution matrix A of the sensitive attributes mapped to each leaf of the tree to contain U in the convex hull. So what we can do is we can strategically split these leaves so that we decrease the distance between the convex hull and U. And I'll show this graphically to give some more intuition. As we do this, so each time we make a new split, we're producing a new leaf. And so the conditional distribution matrix A is going to grow, is going to evolve through this process, gaining an extra row each time a leaf is split. And so to reason about the convex hull of A and derive conditions for what we'll call a good split, it's useful to represent it geometrically. So I'll give a few definitions, and hopefully this will give more kind of intuition for this convex hull analysis. So you can imagine here that I have some convex hull of, let's see. So you can imagine here that I have maybe a proxy tree has 3 proxy groups, and I can look at the conditional distribution matrix the conditional distribution over groups over Z in each proxy group. So each of those will give me a point on this convex hull. I would like it to be the case that the convex hull here contains the uniform distribution U. Each of these vertices, I'll say that V, which is just going to be a binary sequence, is a vertex, and I'll have some mapping R that maps it to a row in A. So then V is going to be a vertex of C of A if basically RV corresponds to a row in A, such that AI is not in the convex hull of the others, so it's not redundant. But basically, you can just think of every vertex here as corresponding to one of the rows of A or one of the leaves in the tree. And we'll talk about a splitting function. We'll call it H, and H is going to map X. So these non-sensitive attributes is going to take a sample and basically map it to 0 or 1, left or right. And that's how we'll split a leaf. We'll talk about L sub V, which is the set of samples at some vertex V. Vertex split results from applying H sub V, so some splitting function associated with that vertex, to the samples in that vertex, forming two new child vertices, V0 and V1. And when a vertex V is split, forming new vertices V0 and V1, the distance from the convex hull of A to U is going to decrease by at least a factor of 1 minus gamma if this inner product, R of V1 minus R of V with U minus U prime, normalized, is sufficiently large. U prime here is the closest point on the convex hull to U. So if the convex hull contains U, then we have a perfect balancing solution, and U prime should equal U. Otherwise, we're going to have some vector between U and U prime, and we'd like to essentially drag the convex hull in that direction. So we'd like to take a vertex, and we'd like to split it so that the convex hull kind of grows in the direction of U. And what's nice about this is that we can rewrite it as a linear objective function. So this property that R of V1 minus R of V in a product with U minus U prime, normalized by the L2 distance U minus U prime, that's sufficiently large is going to be equivalent to this linear expression here. So H sub V here is a splitting function. So it's going to be kind of, we want to minimize this, which is why I switched the direction here. But again, this is going to be essentially asking that we're moving in the direction of that vector U minus U prime. So now that we have a linear objective function, we can write down a convex program. And this is where we can actually incorporate the desiderata that we want this tree to be no more than alpha disclosive. So we can ask that each time we grow the tree, so each time we make a split, we're going to minimize this objective. So try to maximize that dot product, subject to the condition that when we make a split, neither of those two new vertices are more than alpha disclosive. And once we have this formulation, we can apply some standard strategies for solving convex programs. So we can use strong duality to rewrite this objective program in the form of a Lagrangian, where we have a primal variable, which is going to be our splitting function, and dual variables, which are going to be penalizations on those constraints. The constraints, again, being that neither of those two new vertices is more than alpha disclosive. And under appropriate conditions, so under appropriate convexity conditions and compactness, Solving this program is equivalent to finding the min-max solution of this Lagrangian. And then finally, what this allows us to do is to simulate a zero-sum two-player game between a learner and an auditor to find a solution to this program if it exists. So the way that you can think about this is that I have some learner who's a primal player, and they're trying to find a splitting function, h, to decrease the value of the game. So they're trying to find a splitting function that is going to drag the convex hull in the direction of this uniform vector. The auditor is going to penalize any violations. So if I try to drag the convex hull in the direction where one of those two new vertices is too disclosive, that'll get penalized. And if we keep doing this over and over again, a result by Freud and Scapiri shows that if the sequence of actions for each player jointly has low regret, so is kind of close to the best solution in hindsight, then the uniform distribution over each player's actions will form an approximate equilibrium. And this will give us a solution to our program. So what this does is it gives us a subroutine that we can use in finding this alpha beta proxy or finding this tree. So it gives us a way to intelligently make a split at each iteration of the tree that is going to make sufficient progress gamma and is not going to be too disclosive. So the way that we'll do this is we're going to just start with a stump, and we're going to say, okay, let's look at the distribution over, so the stump being one proxy group. We'll say, okay, let's imagine that everyone is sorted into just proxy group 1. What is the distribution over sensitive attributes in proxy group 1? We look at how close that is to the uniform distribution. So if it's, 60% women, 40% men, and we want to get to 50-50, then we're not done. So we'll try to make a split. When we make that split, we're trying to make it so that we get closer to 50-50 with the best sampling scheme, but so that we don't get too disclosive. And we just keep doing this as long as we make sufficient progress. And we can show that if the conditions of the progress lemma are satisfied at every split, so if we can make sufficient progress, then this algorithm will produce an alpha beta proxy in sample within a number of rounds that's logarithmic in beta, and 1 over logarithmic in 1 minus gamma. And then finally, this is nice because it does generalize, although there are some challenges here. So if we let D be the VC dimension of the proxy class D hat, then we can show that with probability 1 minus delta, if each proxy group has sufficient sample size, where that sample size is going to be polynomial in 1 over epsilon, then logarithmic in the VC dimension of Z hat and in the number of groups, then an alpha beta proxy in sample that's going to be an alpha plus 2 epsilon proxy, or alpha plus 2 epsilon and beta plus k epsilon times some constant out of sample. So again, this means that out of sample, we will have a proxy that is a little bit more disclosive by an additive factor of 2 epsilon and is a little bit less balanced by this factor of k epsilon times kind of square root of number of rounds. And again, the thing that's challenging here is that it requires that each proxy group has this sample size. And if we want our tree to get larger and larger, so the longer we run this algorithm, kind of the more proxy groups we're going to have, and the harder it's going to be to actually satisfy this condition.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Are those like log 1 over beta and log 1 over 1 minus gamma, or where is it?
I think it cancels out because of the negatives. You can look at it after, yeah.
And one other question, is the
Mhm.
number of
proxy groups the same as the number of sensitive attributes? No, no. So it typically will not be the same. It can be less than that, or it can be more than that.
I see.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so for the experiments, we look at kind of these two separate methodological contributions. So we look at the first one, which, if you recall, was just saying, okay, let's imagine that we have a fixed proxy function. What's the best possible sampling scheme we can find? And we're calling this the QP proxy approach. The second one was actually trying to learn a proxy function that's guaranteed not to exceed the specified level of disclosivity, and subject to that, kind of has the best level of balance that we can find. And so we'll compare these two, which is the QP proxy and the alpha beta proxy. And we'll compare this to kind of what we call the naive proxy approach. We couldn't find a lot of works that were really trying to do this exact task in the literature. So the best comparison we could think of was just comparing it to kind of the common sense solution, which is to train some model to directly predict the sensitive attribute, and then just taking the same number of samples from each of those predicted groups. So that's what we call the naive proxies. The QP proxies, we can use regression or a decision tree as the base model. And again, we're going to use these to directly predict the sensitive attribute. So this isn't giving us those disclosivity controls. But once we have that model, so once we have that fixed proxy, then we can try to find the best possible sampling scheme according to this sampling algorithm we came up with. And then the third contribution are the alpha beta, and what we call an alpha beta relaxed proxy, which is kind of going through this whole decision tree growing procedure. The relaxed version is that instead of choosing coefficients Q such that they add up to 1, we let them add up to a number less than 1, but they're very similar. The two data sets we look at, the first one is the bank marketing data set. So it has about 45,000 samples and 48 non-sensitive attributes. And the sensitive attribute is job type. I think there were 12 of them. The adult data set has around the same number of samples, 14 non-sensitive attributes, and race is the sensitive attribute. So smaller in terms of the feature dimension. And because the naive and the QP proxies just gave us one model, we wanted to trace out a curve to compare it to what we could get from kind of going over different alpha values for the alpha beta proxy. We interpolate between a uniform and a proxy specific sampling strategy using a post-processing scheme. And I have a slide in the appendix on that if anyone wants to look at it, but I'll just say that that's how we trace out a curve. So what we want to look at here is how the balance and the disclosivity compares. So this is on the bank marketing data set, and these plots have disclosivity on the x-axis and imbalance on the y-axis, because we want to be, generally I like these plots to have kind of the goal be the origin. So the closer kind of points are to the origin, generally the better. So we want to be driving imbalance down. We want to be driving disclosivity down. And here we have red and yellow are the naive approaches. So that was, again, just predicting the sensitive attribute and taking the same number of points from each. Purple and green are the QP approaches. So that was predicting the sensitive attribute and then solving this quadratic program to find kind of a more optimized sampling scheme. And the blue and the black are the alpha beta proxy. So this was the full decision tree growing procedure. And so for this one on the bank marketing data set, the decision tree growing procedure is Pareto dominated. Basically, the kind kind of the others, with the QP decision tree proxy kind of coming in next. The generalization was tricky. I generally had trouble finding good out of sample performance, or at least out of sample performance that really mirror the types of patterns I saw in the training data set. I think that it is because the generalization bounds depend on the smallest group size, proxy group size. We see similar behavior on the adult data set. So again, the relaxed alpha beta proxy Pareto dominates in sample, the QP, which Pareto dominates alpha beta, and then the others kind of trickle in. And again, this is intuitive because as we allow for a higher disclosivity budget, typically the imbalance is going to go down. And then this is more for intuition for how the method's working. So this is a visualization of those conditional distribution matrices. And if you recall, I said that I think Avram asked a good clarification question about this, that initially kind of we're just starting with one proxy group. And if this proxy group kind of had a uniform distribution over sensitive attributes, we'd be done. Now, this is for the adult data set. It does not have a uniform distribution over sensitive attributes. This is the distribution over Z values, so races, given you're in this proxy group. And we see that race 0 has a much higher probability than the other ones. So this is very far from uniform. And so this is an advantage of having this decision tree growing procedure. We can now make a split that hopefully brings us closer to uniform. And if you look at what happens after 2 such splits, we have a new conditional distribution matrix that now has 3 rows, each of which correspond to a proxy group. And now we have in proxy group 0, sensitive attribute 2 is most represented, proxy group 1, sensitive attribute 1 is most represented, and 2, 0 is most represented. This allows us to sample from these groups and get closer to uniform. And this is fairly intuitive, right? This one, like we can never get very close. Here we can probably get at least races 0, 1, and 2 to be about equally represented. But we did this at the expense of some disclosivity budget, because now if I know that you're in proxy group 0, I know a lot more about what your racial group is than if I had just looked at base rates alone. And then this is an example of how the group proportions before and after filtering might change. So this is on the bank marketing data set. We're using the alpha beta relax proxy. And red is the unfiltered data sets. Blue are the filtered data sets. The lighter red and the lighter blue correspond to the training. So we have the in sample results. The darker ones correspond to the out of sample results. And I found this plot interesting because it shows kind of this concept of using the disclosivity parameter as a budget. So when I say that I want to find kind of a sampling scheme that optimizes for balance with disclosivity of only alpha equals 0.1, I can't grow the tree very far. I can't make splits that don't violate that condition. And basically, the filtered data set looks the same as the unfiltered data set because I had probably a stump that I was working with. Now, when I expand that budget, so now I say, okay, we can disclose kind of up to alpha 0.2. Then I can actually find a proxy tree, the sampling strategy that gives me almost a perfectly balanced data set in sample. Again, out of sample, it's not as balanced. And I think that that's because of that dependence on the proxy groups. But in sample, we get something that is very close to balanced. So the experiments show that this alpha beta proxy approach and also this QP proxy approach allow us to improve balance. And in sample, typically the relaxed alpha beta proxy Pareto dominates. And we were happy to see that the QP decision tree proxy also does very well as just the alpha beta proxy itself. And then out of sample, generalization was kind of challenging. The QP desistant tree proxy generalized the best just because it was the simplest, I think. And again, going back to this idea of the two contributions, the QP proxies, which do not optimize for disclosivity, are nice because they are simple. And if you're not worried about directly predicting the sensitive attribute, then you can post-process to get that trade-off. And they do quite well in minimizing imbalance. But again, for lots of situations, and I think lots of kind of legal applications, you do not want to be at any time specifically predicting sensitive attribute. And this is where those alpha beta proxies come in. So these never involve training a classifier that's more disclosive than a pre-specified threshold. Because again, when we're making those splits to grow the tree, we say never have a split that creates a property that's more than alpha disclosive. And then I think this also came up earlier, but our work, so initially we had hoped that this would give us some nice downstream fairness properties, and we were unable to find that empirically, which I think is intuitive. So we don't provide guarantees of the downstream fairness of the models. And the reason that I think that is because there's often a lot of distortion that's induced by this process. So if maybe one way that you could find a data set that's balanced with respect to sex would be to look at undergraduate populations at a lot of universities. Typically, those are about 50% male, 50% women. So I could say, okay, my strategy is going to be just to sample from Penn undergrads. And this might give me a data set that's really balanced, but that's not going to be representative of the population as a whole. If I look at the women at Penn, that's not going to represent US women. If I look at the men at Penn, that's not going to represent US men. And so now if I go and I apply this model to the population in general, I'm not going to get those types of fairness guarantees we might like. So this is an area for future work, and I think it's also just an interesting property. So I will stop there. I think we have a few minutes for questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Emily. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Hey, Emily, really enjoyed the talk. So my question is kind of a higher level question, which is like, the more sensitive attributes I'm trying to balance along, presumably this all is sort of harder. And I just wonder, like, what are some takeaways you might have about like thinking about the number of attributes I can balance for? Yeah, anything on this flavor?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the big takeaways here is that, so I think that a big contribution of this work is that it gives us a different way to think about this type of balancing problem that is not just trying to mimic the sensitive attribute. So it's giving us a way to think about, dividing the data into different groups and sampling from those groups without trying to sort based on sex or based on gender, or whatever attribute you're trying to control for. So that's one of them, and this is interesting because there is such a big debate right now over kind of the use of proxy variables in legal applications, kind of when they're okay, when they're not okay, and typically the arguments against them, or the arguments that try to really kind of control the usage, are looking at correlation. They're saying, okay, it's all well and good if you use zip code instead of race, but that's almost perfectly correlated. So, like, what is that really doing? And so this is a way to get away from that. The other thing that we actually don't have any guarantees in this paper, but I think it would be something that could be nice to derive, is that it's not always possible to get a perfectly balanced data set based on where you start. Different kind of levels of balance will be possible given the starting configuration. And as you have more and more groups that you're trying to balance this back to, this task gets more difficult.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Are there more questions? If not, we can end it here. Maybe